Hello everyone, welcome once again to another tutorial session on Python programming for biologists. In today's video, I am going to show you how you can repeat programming tasks using functions. Before we go into functions, let's look at this program here. The program calculates the percentage GC of a sequence, and this is the sequence. Let me also chip in that the full explanation of this code has been given in an earlier video. So if you want to watch that, you can click the link right up there. Or you can also check it in the description box below. Now back to today's business. This program will calculate the percentage GC of a sequence. But if you want to reuse the code in another program, or even in this same interface, we want to repeat this activity, what will we do? One approach would be to copy the codes and then paste in the next line. And then we run the code. But then, if we are dealing with thousands of lines of codes, then always copying as a way of repeating or reusing the codes will become problematic, especially when you want to manage the codes. And in addition, if let's say you want to modify an aspect of the code, let's say this section here, then it means that whenever you copy, you need to do the modifications there as well. All these things will lead to difficulty in managing the codes and might probably lead to you making some errors along the way. And this is where functions come in. So what is a function? Functions enable us to repeat a set of instructions or operations multiple times. They also enable us to reuse codes many times without having to copy them. And if there's the need to make a change in the code, you only need to do it at one place, and that is where you originally wrote the scripts. Functions also allow us to reuse codes multiple times in multiple programs. And using functions, you are able to split larger problems or tasks into smaller and more manageable ones. Functions will also allow you to better organize and manage your codes. So this leads to the next question: how do we create and use functions? Before we tackle that question, let's review this code again. This code will compute the percentage GC. So if you want to repeat all these commands here, then using functions, we can repeat it without having to necessarily rewrite or copying the codes and pasting again. This is how functions becomes very important in programming. So let me show you how it's done. In order to create functions, the first line of your code or your program should have the keyword def, as for define. This will then be followed by the function name, the name you want to use to call it. And then you add the parentheses to it. If you want to make inputs or you want to be changing the inputs whenever you call the function, then you have to add parameters. This will act as placeholders for your future inputs. Parameters must be placed in the parentheses. And once you are done with this, you end the first line with your colon character. Subsequent lines will contain statements that the functions will execute. In addition, if The outputs that will be generated will have to be used outside the function. Then a return statement must be issued at the end of your quotes. That's the quotes for the function. And then the return statements, you specify what variable or output you want to push out. So whenever you call the function, the result that you get will be the output. Let me show you how it's done with the code that we displayed earlier on. So we begin by creating the function. We therefore say def. Then we add the name of the function. Here we will say %GC. I'm using the underscore to represent the space character because Python does not allow you to use a space character in names. So if you need to add space, then you substitute it with the underscore. Okay. After you've given the function name, that's the name you will use to call it. Then you specify your parentheses. Then you end with your colon. I earlier made mention of parameters, but we will look at that in the later session of the video. So this is our function. So this function here will do. The subsequent lines will contain the statements you want to execute. And please note that this is a block statement. So that means any command or statement or code that belongs to the function should be indented. That is why we have it here like this. Okay, if it's like this, you get an error. So you make sure you put them here. Then you have it there. Some code editors will automatically fix that for you, but you should always check it manually to ensure that it's done. Okay, this is just a comment, so that's fine. After you have this created, you can now run the function. To call the function, all that you need to do is to just mention it by the name here. Therefore, we will say %GC. This is how we call it. And then when we run it, we will get the results. This program here will compute the GC content and then just print it out for us. And that is what we have done here. If you wanted to repeat this code, to reuse this code, then we don't have to copy. All that we need to do is to just call the function name again, like what we are going to do now. And then we run it. So it has been done for us. So you can repeat this multiple times without having to copy and pasting the codes. So this is what functions are for. Now let's take a look at the code again. The program will compute the GC content and then print it. But then if we wanted to reuse these codes here, okay, reuse this value, the GC rounded value, that's the GC content value. Then if we were to just print it here, like this, then we will get an error. We are getting an error because it has not been defined. Even though it's in this function here, we cannot have access to it because variables in a function will exist only within that function. We call these variables local variables. And so if you wanted to reuse this particular value here in a later program, or you wanted to get access to it, then we need to add a return statement. When we add a return statement, then we assign the entire function to another variable. Then the value will be pushed to that variable. Let me show you how. We will just use this function again. Okay, and then another step. So let's just recreate this function again here. So what we will do is to add the return keyword. I will clear this print statement and then add return. So what are we returning? This value here, the GC rounded. So we say return GC rounded. So we have created a function that will push the output for us. And so if you have a task of this nature, then what you need to do is to assign the function name that you call to another variable. So let's just call the variable, let's say GC, or let's just say GC value. Then we add our equals to sign, and then we call the function like this. So let's execute it. When we execute, nothing is being displayed because we don't have any print statements here. But then we have this value here for this operation assigned here. Therefore, we can print that one. So when we print it, this is what we get. We have it there. Okay. So notice how that has been done nicely for us. Okay. But if we were to do copying and pasting, that would be a different story altogether. And so the return statement will help you to get access to values that are within that function. Okay, so that is also done. Now, there's another thing you need to also check. In this function, we had this DNA sequence here. It's fixed. So this function was always calculating the GC content for this sequence. But in a real world situation, you might have several sequences that you want to do the computation for. So let's look at how we can modify our function to be able to accept future inputs. And this is where the parameters come in. Let me show you how it's done. So let's recreate the function again. So we say def percentage GC. Now parameters should be placed in the parentheses. So let's just say whenever we call the function, we want to supply it with a sequence. So in the parameter, we give a placeholder. So let's say sequence. Please note this is different from a variable. So we give it this one here. Then we add our colon. So we are done with the first line. When we come to the second line or the subsequent lines, let's paste this example code here. We don't need this, but you can just leave it. It's a comment. When we come here, instead of having this fixed value here, we can assign this to sequence. Okay, we can assign it to that one. So what this means is that whenever you call the function and you supply it with a sequence, that sequence will be assigned to this variable. And then from there, all the computations will be done on that particular variable. So this is a placeholder that will represent any sequence you use as an input. So now we have this done. Okay, so let's just proceed. So we have this. So let's look at an example. you have sequence, let's say we have sequence 1, which is AGCCTTCAG. We have this. I'll put all the sequences in the description box. And then we have sequence 2. Let's say AAATTCGA. So if you want to find the percentage GC, let's say for sequence 1, we can say, let's say GC 1 will be equals to percentage GC, and we give SIC 1. So let's execute it. So now if you want to look at the percentage GC for that one, you can say print GC 1, and then the value will be given to you. Let's do for sequence 2. GC2 will be equals to percentage GC SIC 2. We run it, and then we can print it. Say GC2. Notice that one has also been given to us. And so if you were to have some larger programs, then using the parameters, you can reuse the codes anyhow you want it. Okay, you just need to customize and specify your input values here. Okay, so that's parameters. By the parameters we have here is set up such that you should always supply an input. You should always supply an input. Okay, so if I should call, let's just say GC again. If I should just call it like this without supplying any inputs, you will have an error. It says what? Percentage GC missing one required positional argument, which is sequence, because we set that one up here. So we can put a default value that whenever we call the function and we don't supply it with any sequence, it will calculate it on that particular sequence. And so to do that, we can still use the same statement, the same function here. Let's just copy the code here and then place it here. And then here we will say sequence equals ATGCCTG. So when we have this, then let's come back again and say GC is equals to percentage GC. Now let's run this again. Okay, so we've called that function. So let's print it. Okay, so notice it has given us an answer because we did not supply any argument here. Therefore, it's looked it up here and then saw that we had a default value there, and then it's used that. So this is how functions work. Okay, so using functions, you'll be able to do a lot of stuff without having to repeat your codes. And from this tutorial, all others I'm going to make sure I include some functions into them. So try and then get the concept of functions. And in later videos, we also look at advanced forms of functions that you can use to customize your scripts and codes more. So thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next session. Goodbye.